Thank you so much for presentation and inviting me here, and I'm very happy to be here and talk about it. I would also like to say that it's I hope it's to be generative open discussion, so you are very welcome. If you have any questions, any thoughts, we have a more open exchange on this very important topic this day. So I will shortly present maybe why we should do this research and why it's important and why we should think about urban planning and urban development in terms of decolonization. And I think what's interesting here is also the method, the decolonial methods and methodology. So we will talk about it, how one can research cities under conditions of war and occupation. And look at some theories and also to have some to have some also theoretical framing of what's going on in occupied cities, but also what's going on currently in terms of urban planning and urbanism in Ukraine. So I think it's why it's interesting or it's particularly important this day to talk about this topic. It's basically, as if you see news these days, you hear a lot about Trump peace deal, that Trump promised that he will end war very fast. And there is this oversimplified perception of Russian invasion of Ukraine or Russian war in Ukraine, that it's some kind of short-term instantaneous violence or spectacular accidental violence, which you can finish very fast. And then after you finish this war, there will be this linear process of reconstruction. And reconstruction is some kind of result of warfare, result of urban destruction. And if you finish this war, by any means, whatever it would mean, there would be some kind of peaceful rebuilding back as it should be. Yes, and this position is spreading, and I think in Germany there is a lot of pressure these days to have peace talks to end this war, and especially in more like right-wing parties, also a populist party. You can see like on the picture Viktor Orban meets Donald Trump in Florida, and he's very excited to hear about Trump peace deal in Ukraine. And yes, and this it's very widespread understanding of reconstruction is linear process of what's happened aftermath. So it's just something out there which is consequence of war. And yes, and this comes from this perception. They come from very many. This comes from very many conditions. So first of all, it's epistemic injustice and limited academic, I would say particularly academic knowledge on the forms of Russian colonialism and recognition of it as such. And I want to one more time highlight here the word academic, because it's not like people in Ukraine, they don't know they are subjects of colonialism, or you don't have that this embodied knowledge of colonialism does not matter. It just production of knowledge itself marginalizes the position of our other who is not in the West or West North. In particular, if we talk about urban planning, there is also this idea about urban planning, which comes from modernist times, that urban planning is rather rational, technical, positive exercise to improve people's lives. So we can, if we connect about reconstruction, it's something like, you take urban planning because we need to build houses, and it's not like ideological, it's just task to have, because urban planning, also in Germany, it's often classified as technical discipline, so it's some kind of technological fix, which no matter who wins, it will happen anyway. And if we see on my discipline too, critical urban theory with some exceptions, it's rather overlooked settler colonial context. And it's also because of this particularities of knowledge production in Western academia, it's always, or most of it, focus on colonialism in the West or colonial past of the West. And even though still not very deep through, or it's very limited discussion. And if we also look at Ukraine now, it's since the beginning of war, a lot of discussions happening, and I would say that decolonization or decolonizing knowledge, it's collective, not individual project. But still, a lot of these discussions, they go rather like about the past or heritage, including current discussions how to deal with Soviet and imperial heritage in Ukraine. And these discussions, they far away, or they don't look at urban planning and decolonization and the processes nowadays. With of course, with exception, I don't want to present here that I'm only one I know about this topic. Yes, so it's very limited understanding of interrelations of urbanism and colonialism in shaping present cities, particularly in the context of Russian war in Ukraine. So I wanted for myself, like doing this presentation or doing this some kind of activism research which emerges in my practice from time to time. I wanted to discover relations between colonialism, warfare, and urbanism. And I talk about urbanism that including spatial planning and spatial practice within Russian war on Ukraine. And I want to also emphasize that spatial planning, that is kind of reordering of space that goes beyond an administrative and material dimension. So I'm not talking about something like urban planning sitting in office per se. And I include here the notions of spatial practice and recognition as a recognition of lived experience of the city and co-production of space and human and more than human in the city. So I also don't want to victimize people and present this urban planning as some kind of top-down exercise from which people and citizens are excluded. So even if we don't know or this knowledge is not there, we should just remember that this co-production and participation and our lived lives matter under these processes. And what I find is interesting, how to research this kind of topic. Like, how do you research, for instance, occupied cities where you cannot go, you cannot do research? I want to also emphasize that research here and writing on decolonialism is per se decolonial methods. And this methods is rather collective than individual projects. And so currently in Ukraine, there are many people, many journalists, they are dealing with this topic, even though they don't submerge or emerge in Western academia. It does not mean that this knowledge does not exist there, and it does not mean that I'm the one who knows it all, but I want to say that I just give some contribution to this collective moment of rethinking our past and our practice these days. And for me, it's also kind of research which deals with very uncomfortable and undesired knowledge. I mean, it's very uncomfortable because you need to read a lot about murder, destruction, and death. So you like involved in this trauma relieving, but it's undesired knowledge. It's very, of course, undesired knowledge for Russia to emerge there. But it's also in many cases undesired knowledge even in Germany, because the easiest answer is like, we need to end the war and everything will be good, and reconstruction some kind of will return everything to the place where it was, no matter who wins. So you kind of bring in this kind of knowledge that it matters who wins and it matters who reconstruct, create some kind of breakage in the simplicist logic of peace building and war recovery. And I want to say, like, I've been to some presentation of similar research, and often a question emerge: what is my method? So, like, are my methods rigorous enough to even be considered a science? Or like, how do I do this research? Because of course it's not empirically bounded research where I went to Mariupol and talked to city representatives, or I don't know, I have very rigorous empirically based data in the cities, but I want to also emphasize that the facts that we don't know, and then I cannot know what reconstruction means in these projects of Russian totalitarian project, where for Russia I don't exist, I cannot participate there, I cannot contest these processes, and I cannot be part of these processes. It's already refers to this colonial condition and how this knowledge is produced. And yes, and I consider this some kind of reflection, way of reading an unfinished generative discussion, which many researchers and theoreticians in Ukraine, they also emphasize that how important to find the words, that it's a lot of information out there, but how it's painful when unnamed is named falsely, or when the unnamed remains unnamed. So yes, so I want to invite you to this generative discussion where we search the words and we try to name the processes, what's going on in Ukraine now. And short also notice it's some kind of auto-ethnographic project for me, because I participate myself in some initiatives in Ukraine, so I always reflect why I'm doing it and why I'm there and what does it mean in general. So just small words about this topic. So like it's not completely new terra incognita, and this research is there and for many years. And there is also, for instance, a lot of research on herbicides, which is understood as violent campaigns against built environments, the destruction of buildings and condition of possibility of being with others. And even some Ukrainian researchers also wrote about it on herbicide in Ukraine, but also indirect herbicide of occupied Ukrainian cities through mismanagement, fragmentation of urban space, decay of infrastructures. There is also research about targeting of architecture and heritage, and targeting and destruction of building as form of purification of symbols of ethnic mix from the city. So this is exactly what is on this map, which I took from the book on Sarajevo. And this map, it's analyzed which kind of buildings were destroyed, and shows that a lot of buildings that are connected to ethnic mix of the city, they were destroyed. And also some research there which particularly focus on targeting infrastructure, infrastructural warfare, and switching off cities. Yeah, but I want to say we talk about it with my friends sometimes, and some kind of this term of herbicides, particularly myself, I found it unproductive, so it does not give me so much. So I understand that there is war and the buildings are destroyed, and of course the buildings, they have some more significance than being buildings. They have some symbolic and cultural and community building potential. But from this term, personally, me is also in some discussions with my friends, we could not go further, or like it did not give us answers for what's particularly going on in Ukrainian cities somewhere. So I wanted to give here to this looking at all of this and having this warfare, urbanism, destruction, given to it one more dimension. And I want to look on urban destruction is not solely as consequence of warfare or a form of warfare, but I want to see how urbanism and warfare are subjugated to the logic of colonialism. So I kind of, for me, it's warfare, urbanism, colonialism axis when these processes are happening simultaneously. And I want also to invite you to start a speculative proposal. So I want us not to see urbanism as some kind of urban destruction, reconstruction is some kind of consequence of war. But I want to see how war is first step of settler colonial urbanism. So like settler colonial urbanism, urbanization and reconstruction, they go on the order higher aim. So the aim is not a war itself. The aim is capital accumulation, military expansion, territorial expansion, building, rebuilding, what is called like urbanism as a frontier of military expansion, but also aim of it as technology of extraction and accumulation, a so-called spatial fix by David Harvey, but we can also call it in this case of Russia colonial fix, as a fix to capital, to the problems of capital accumulation within Russia. And yes, and the center of all of this, both destruction, warfare, and urbanism is is urban settlement. And I really like this quote from Porter and Iftahel. Settlement, or more simply invasion, is given material presence and organizational shape through the process of urbanization. So in general, and I want to see it on this some kind of complex simultaneous axis, and I want to start from warfare as a first step of the settler colonial urbanism. And yes, doing or thinking about it, I tried to find some steps or some forms or some technology, one can call it technologies or methodologies of urbanism, colonialism, warfare altogether. And at the beginning, I wanted to make it as a steps. So you start from destruction and you have some steps for the depopulation, reordering, reconstruction, and repopulation. But a lot of the steps, they happen simultaneously. So in a way that both warfare, urbanism, and destruction, they all kind of mix. And I want to see how can we look at it and these processes. So if you see on this axis urbanism, colonialism, warfare, destruction, I would also invite you to look at it as warfare as part of violent deplanning, turning into urban terra nullis, which basically destruction of the past, and this terra nullis, the land which belonged to no one. It's this, if you look at settlers' colonial studies or colonization, it's kind of first step of nation development, first step of everything, claiming that there was nothing before us or making it happen that there is nothing about us. And I would say that this warfare or violent destruction of cities, it's a destruction, first of all, of past, which would allow this further settler colonial construction. And if we look, it's also like, I would like to give here this temporal dimension. And if we go back to this destruction of infrastructure, so-called forced modernization by Graham, it's also destruction of way of life, but it's destruction of present, impossibility of living further on these lands. And going back, starting from warfare as a destruction of past, we go to planning as reconstruction, which is destruction of the future for indigenous people of this land, so people who was before warfare. And yes, returning back to this wonderful text about urbanizing settlers' colonialism by Porter and Iftahel, and how we can look at this planning and reconstruction and urbanization is to render the urban as a place not indigenous, profoundly spatially and temporarily disconnected from indigenous histories and geographies, despite the obvious fact in settler colonial societies that most cities and settlements sit on unceded territories. So kind of render these spaces unlived. And yes, it just returning to destruction by military means. It's a map of Mariupol by Financial Times, which shows the scale of destruction which happened in the city. And continuing with this like next framing of further analysis. So after this destruction, what happens? Of course, depopulation, and depopulation or ethnic cleansing in settlers' colonial studies is a result of warfare and direct targeting of civil infrastructures, first of all, but also it's a result of deportations. If we remember, the executive order for Putin from International Human Rights Court was for deportation of Ukrainian children from occupied territory. And here we can see that on the example of cities of Mariupol, the population of the city declined from more than 400,000 people to a bit less than 100,000. And within this process, it's 50,000 people were deported. But the depopulation is not only some kind of results of warfare. Depopulation, it's also a result of a mechanism of reconstruction and rebuilding. First of all, by limitation of access to critical and social infrastructure, or creating conditions of this rebuilt infrastructure to access of that, for instance, acceptance of Russian passport. But if we go, it gets even more complex. So as in many contexts, the researchers, they always name that it's kind of depopulation and ethnic cleansing. It's also a result of legal technologies of dispossession as displacement as part of reconstruction. And in Mariupol, for instance, we could see it on the example by housing program and housing construction in Mariupol. Or housing reconstruction in Mariupol. So there would be different laws, which, for instance, will demand to register and re-register again properties within short term, and further confiscation. And these properties, those which were not registered in 30 days, for instance, they would be confiscated into communal ownership. And there would be this, of course, short term that if people are abroad, they cannot return, or if they don't have Russian passports, they cannot register. So for those Ukrainians living there, there would be this multiple bureaucratization, which would also serve as a way of filtration and dispossession from these properties. But also, even though people, if they manage to register their destroyed properties, there would be some other mechanism like insufficient compensation for destroyed properties that would not allow buying homes again. So basically, people would give some amount of money if they are lucky for destroyed property. I don't know, like according to Beckett or this article, it's 2025, sorry, the second one is not correct. So basically, they would give people, let's say, 20,000 euro for their property, but they built a new house on that territory, and the apartment in that complex cost 50,000 euro. And with their 20,000 euros, they cannot buy this new apartment, and they need to move somewhere else, so probably move out of that city at all, or search a refuge somewhere else. And it's interesting, this researcher, which unfortunately I put the wrong here again in the end, is she calls it ethnic cleansing by home loan, exclusion of Ukrainians from housing loans programs. And yes, if we talk about this loan program and the aim of the settler colonial reconstruction, urbanism, warfare, it's also the repopulation, and repopulation is on one hand is done by using racialized migrant labor for rebuilding under false pretenses and promise of Russian passport. So there are multiple reports and even complaints of embassies that the Russian government of this program, they will invite this Russian racialized minorities in Russia, but also people from Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and multiple countries to be part of it without fully explaining the meaning of it or what they will get, or sometimes even further sending them to fight against Ukraine. But also returning to this loan programs, there would be also preferential loan programs of 2% in comparison to 21% or yearly interest rate, which is Russian average. For newly built homes in occupied territories of Luhansk, Donetsk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia, mostly for those employed by state, the teachers, medical workers, military personnel. And these loans, they would be even like only possible to get on this occupied territories. So many people in Russia, there's some kind of persuasive maybe way to get their home. And going back to reconstruction itself, or if we think about reconstruction itself and the previous destruction, repopulation, and urban planning, it's also a promise of growth, promise of repopulation. And if we see shortly after invasion in the mid of 2022, Russians, they kind of presented master plan of rebuilding Mariupol. And this plan, ignoring the realities, they would promise the city growth in up to 2025, but also up to 500,000 in 2035. So with some kind of promises prosperity that, but with legal mechanism also invite people to participate in this growth. And it's important here that here this master plan or urban planning is also preposition of permanence. If we see that colonial violence through warfare has much shorter temporality than reconstruction and infrastructure. So basically war, it can be over in year 2, 10 years, but infrastructural rebuilding can last years, 10, 20 years, and it lasts centuries after it, what happens there. And also it's interesting quote that to plan is an inherently temporal proposition. It is to make a serious claim about future. Particularly presenting these building images, presenting master plan is a way of this proposition of permanence. And also when somewhere talking about somewhere talking before about cities and war, I mentioned this, or I hope I mentioned, I don't remember, forced demodernization, cutting off city, turning them into dark ages. And after this forced destruction and demodernization, I would call that urban planning, the Russian urban planning here is forced remodernization, so bringing back, but Russian. In Ukraine, we have this saying about building back better. And here I would say it's building back by Russian, and often this urban planning serves as top-down propaganda exercise, but both for local and international audiences, because of course it shows that if Russia wins the war, something will happen and it will bring peace and, I don't know, homes for people living in the city, without mentioning who are that cities, but it's a good picture you can show somewhere and use further as propaganda. Yes, and then this plan, I would say, it's not the real urban planning. So I say that urban planning is top-down propaganda exercise because it's basically by various sources, it's appropriated existing Ukrainian plan of Mariupol before 2016 without accounting for destruction or warfare. So it basically has nothing to do with real urban development or how it looks. Yes, and just we've seen. And also, it's like if it's the beginning, I said that all this urbanization, colonialism, and warfare is some kind of simultaneous and interrelated process. And I would say that reconstruction here is also part of military complex and by employment of Russian military buildings on the occupied territory, so-called special military construction crews, that they would also build. Like they would build the military buildings, but they would build also civil buildings and often ideologically marked. As here, Russia, my history park in occupied Melitopol, which kind of it's just exhibition which presents a great history of Russia for newly occupied people. Yes, and this last one, I would say that urbanism, colonialist warfare, it's some kind of reordering. First, on the first way is reordering of borders via warfare, but it's also reordering of belongings culturally, symbolically, and back infrastructurally. And first, it's about reordering hierarchies in society. So I like this also quote of Schenkel or reference to Schenkel and Hetmanova, Ukrainian researcher, who says that this rebuilding or infrastructural rebuilding in Mariupol allows the state to penetrate the most intimate spheres of people's daily lives and observe their behavior, but also this humanitarian politics via infrastructure allows its subject to be saved. And in the beginning, I also mentioned this, that we need to take account of spatial practice. We need to take account that lived lives of people matter and people participate themselves by their lives in creation of spaces, and it's this kind of reordering, top-down master planning. People are always the one who help, who save, but not the one who have any agency or choice in this saving. And it's also about this reordering of belongings, culturally, symbolically, and infrastructurally, happens through the system of regional patronage and reconstruction. For instance, some cities in Russia, they would become responsible for reconstruction of these territories. For instance, St. Petersburg will patronize Mariupol, and Moscow will patronize Lugansk and Donetsk. And this patronage, which will mean the erection of defenses, funds for construction and restoration work, provision of materials, equipment, and skilled workforce, the secondment of middle and lower level management personnel. And this, it has some, of course, some financial dimension, that is the decentralization of financing of this reconstruction, but also in this way the reconstruction of the territories it destroyed in war into common cause and nationwide construction projects for Russians. So it's a bit depressing everything, so I wanted to give this agency or perspective or resistance that there is some way or something to be done with it. And I want to return to my to my initial proposal, so maybe we can look at it again. So we would say that this kind of warfare is embedded in settlers' colonial urbanism, and where warfare is the first step of urbanism. So if we go back to what I want to say about urbanism resistance warfare, I want to say that the first state of Ukrainian rebuilding is also warfare. Its ability to stay put at Ukrainian territory, and then the military defense itself gives the possibility for reconstruction. So when I was doing also naming the slides, I decided to keep warfare because I don't want also to idealize this process that the Russian urbanism is somehow it's connected to warfare, but Ukraine magically can rebuild itself without any defense. So I kept this axis of urbanism, resistance, and warfare. But just saying that this warfare, it's the first step of urbanism, the first step of ability to be put at Ukrainian territory against all these processes of deconstruction, depopulation, reordering, settlers, colonial reconstruction. And also going back to my initial proposal of temporal dimension about thinking through it also as a past, present, and future, I would say what's this resistance or this processes, what's going on in Ukraine now about planning Ukrainian city, which are also occupied or destroyed. It has this dimension, ability to claim past, ability to have present, and ability to have a future, as dreaming is important part of decolonial methodology. And just a bit, as I don't have a lot of time, I will say a couple couple words about this urbanism resistance warfare in reconstruction. So if we think about ability to claim past, it's recognition, first of all, of urban trauma and the preservation of memories through planning. And just to name a few, the projects which currently working with reconstruction in Ukraine of the cities. So imagine in the cities, they often include people. So here on the picture is part of urban plan developed by Roskvit Coalition, which also worked with people from Mariupol and collected stories and memories of citizens of Mariupol about life in the city before the invasion and their survival. So also these Ukrainian plans, unlike Russian plans, they also will deal with places of trauma in the city, Mariupol, drama theater, Azovstal, steel plant, among the others. But also important this interpretive nature of past. So what Russia and top-down planning does, it's kind of makes this bare land with nothing before them, And even if we look at this reconstruction project, so invitation to do plans for Ukrainian cities, they always have some, they invite multiple extras and invite multiple proposals in collaboration with multiple partners, creating different plans and different paths of it. And other thing that also I wanted to emphasize is urban planning is ability to have present, of course, because as I showed this urban plan of Mariupol, it's some kind of copy-paste, top-down proposal for propaganda, and a lot of projects, so initiatives, so bottom-up initiatives in Ukraine. What happened is that they also collective exercise to keep community alive, and to have possibility for this community to stay put through reconstruction of housing and infrastructure. So it's a lot of bottom-up citizens-led initiative, for instance. Also for youth, I would here on a picture, it's a picture also of my friend who participated in this camp. There also would be a camps of repair together or build Ukraine together, where young people from whole Ukraine will come together and rebuild buildings which newly freed territories. Or there will be also citizens-led or grassroots projects to rebuild housing for displaced. I also the project I worked at some time was Kohate project by MetaLab, and they have very also beautiful saying how they work. So they call it community building through building for communities, and this all it's being together, it's preservation of communities, but also rebuilding these infrastructures. As I said, this destruction of infrastructure leads to impossibility to live in this city. And the last one is this claim about ability to have future and imagining alternative projects to Russian enforced modernity and having communities to rebuild. So this being together and making these plans of working together is some kind of staying in touch also for displaced community of Ukraine. And also it's one of the projects I've been this summer in Lviv. It's workshops by Panorama Ukraine. Panorama Ukraine is a project based in Netherlands, which designs Ukrainian city together with municipalities and students in Ukraine, and have different workshops and gives plans. And they also themselves, they say that this Panorama Ukraine, they have a design dimension, but also serves to give people hope. Just to summarize a bit, because we looked at it through some temporality perspective, but just give also a couple more words. I want to say that unlike this authoritarian top-down project, it's a Ukrainian, what's going on in Ukraine now, it's more like unfinished open project, which has bottom-up nature and it's collective, but I would say it's still contested, so I don't want to have this duality and presentation too, that everything which going on in Ukraine now, every reconstruction project is great and it's all great and give us money and everything would be perfect. But I think it's still not fully inclusive. It still reproduce multiple hierarchies, like who are the people involved in this project, so which roles people have in these projects. Like even if we talk about people from Mariupol, this participative urban planning, sometimes a bit of tokenism, that you talked a bit to people, but it's not really like they did a lot. So I would say on this some practical, formal implementation, it's not always perfect. And of course, many projects, they reproduce neoliberal logics, often with self-responsibilization on the lines of solidarity, that it's kind of this glorification of self-organization. It's also hides some kind of lack of social support in Ukraine, like a lack of just housing provision. But I want to say that the fact that me, my colleagues, or anyone can contest it, can say it, can provide this critique, and there is this critique. It's also the sign of open projects, because under conditions of this totalitarian occupation, of course, no one asks about your opinion, how inclusive in the project. So I want to say that even though these processes of resistance, reconstruction are not perfect in Ukraine, and I don't want to claim they are perfect or they give a solution or it's an easy task to perform, but they clearly have this opposite character of what's going on. Yes, and I would also like to emphasize that what I'm doing is some kind of theoretical framing and a way of reading. So I would be very interested to hear your ideas and questions, and yes, and open a discussion. There's some sources, a lot of them.
I'm supporting you.
Thank you.
Yeah, the floor is open for questions, comments. May I start?
Yes.
I'm curious about the success of this top-down forced remodernization by Russia. So, is there an interest for Russian settlers to go in this territory? Is there an interest for investors to buy, if you are not in Mariupol, to buy an apartment as a kind of investment? So are there any data to see this, or is it mainly a complicated rebuilding for those who are still there? And who with a new house have to accept Russian citizenship and so on and so on. Yeah, so also consequences. Maybe you can explore this a bit.
Yes. I mean, I don't know how to evaluate success of this rebuilding or programs. It depends what you're trying to achieve. If you're trying to achieve some kind of further displacement and ethnic cleansing and maybe some new ways of capital accumulation, it is probably partly successful. So somebody is buying that apartment. They are not apartments built for Ukrainians, and as that the mortgages or loans, they also excludes Ukrainians. And then the prices to the apartments are remaining rather high. So what I was reading before, they would mention $50,000 for apartment, or also, so it's, if you take into account that it's half ruined, occupied cities and the complex legal situation, but for these mortgages, it's still, I believe, attractive. Also for Russians living, not for all, but I can believe also you mentioned in the beginning about this private alternative, without alternative private property in Russia, that you kind of also in countries around Eastern Europe, that this ownership of housing is very important, and there are very few resources to access this ownership. I could say that it might be attractive for some people to have this 2% of loans. And there also in some last years, there were many also videos or investigative articles about new property markets development in Mariupol, about so-called razrushka, these destroyed apartments which are sold for investors. So I would say there might be people who are buying or for whom there is rationality, but also we should think about it that there is a huge propaganda machine about what exactly the city is, or how exactly these apartments are rebuilt. So people buying it, they might not also fully understand the framing of how city, what exactly going on to the city. Also, the numerous journalistic investigations about many people also from global south or from this racialized Russian minorities being lured to this reconstruction project under false premises of high salaries or free apartments or so on, but they got very disappointment in the end of how this salaries looks like or apartments looks like or what they get in the end. So it's some kind of mix of propaganda that it's successfully working, and there are some people who are involved in it, also ordinary people in this some kind of wartime housing, financialization, and the occupation. Yeah, but it's I particularly could not say that it's successful for Ukrainian people whose housing was destroyed and who maybe need of housing for themselves or who would like to stay put in the city. But these loans and technologies and reconstruction is particularly legalized in a way to exclude them.
Yeah, thank you. Questions, comments?
Thank you very much for the presentation. I wanted to come back to one term that was recurring in your presentation, and that is the term modernization. Katerina also asked about this Russian remodernization, and I wanted to ask what this is. Do you assume there is a specific Russian concept of urban modernity that these new city planning projects are referring to, or that they're going back to? And what kind is that? Is that the Sotsgorod? Or what is it? What does Russian modernization mean? And if there's a Russian modernization, is there also a Ukrainian one, or are the Ukrainian urban projects or planning, do they also have reference? What do they reference as opposed to this Russian remodernization, Sotsgorod, or whatever it is?
Yes, thank you so much for this interesting question. So I mostly use this term, or it's also forced demodernization is coming from researcher Graham. I think the article something like 2006 talking about switching off cities in the Russian invasion in Iraq, I think, and it's a lot about this concept of killing modernity and bringing back dark ages. So the infrastructure is ruined. So there is no light, no electricity, no water in itself. So this kind of return to some darker ages through this targeted military destruction of infrastructure. So I just like referring to this term, I use this remodernization, which kind of, it has this temporal dimension that it was destroyed and forcibly destroyed, and there was this nothing, the land which belongs to no one, the dark age, and what Russia brings, it's kind of saving through this infrastructure, bringing back modernity, basically giving back water and electricity to people and improving back their lives, so giving their lives some kind of possibility to have back modern urban lives these days. But this remodernization, what I talk for me, it also refers a lot of this demodernization, that it was forcibly destructed to allow people to allow this saving, to allow to bring this new project of modernity given from above, that you can say, I save somebody, I give them better way of life, because without us, if we would leave them, they would live in rubble. But I also would say, I mean, that what's democratic urban planning, or what you call democratic participatory communicative urban planning, is much different from top-down urban planning, which somehow have always this idea how we, also in reference to Sotsgorod, or also rebuilding or settlers colonialism somewhere in the Russian north before that, it has some idea that this previous way of life, it's wrong, it's not correct, that indigenous people, they somehow wrong and dirty, and we need to save them by building our own infrastructure and reorganizing the spaces by some giving them top-down picture how we imagine their life should be So I would say if we talk about this urban planning generated modernity, like Russian versus Ukraine, this democratic character would be the main difference, or openness or participation or ability even to propose your version of it, to publicly discuss your version of it within this recipients of some kind of modernity or version given to you how you should live.
Yeah, but I think the question goes also a little bit deeper, also referring to architecture. So what kind of idea of modernity it has? If you look, for example, to Moscow suburbs, yeah, with this high buildings everywhere and few centers. So the idea could be just to give the people housing and to create as much as apartments and the higher better for investments. And we have the Russian big construction companies moving in with their Central Asian guest workers and doing the same as in Moscow suburbs. So, or do they have a vision of the city? So some of your pictures look like that they try also to implement buildings with where they can show Russian patriotism or something. So what is the idea of the city? Is there any knowledge about that?
Yes, I want just to say for me as well, but also urban researchers, so how I focus for me, the buildings itself or the form of the building, it's not so important and social connections which these buildings entails. So you would see nowadays very similar architecture somewhere in US suburbs, in China suburbs, in Moscow suburbs. It does not mean that all this architecture, it entails the same way of life or so-called the same way of modernity. So what I was looking, for instance, doing this presentation is not more which physical form it takes, but which symbolic or social transformation this processes entails. But of course, if we, for instance, there was this slide about this Russian My History Park in occupied of Melitopol, and it has some also physical embodiments that we would this patriotism or put in the symbolism of a Russian church or the posters of being Russia forever, or given some like symbolic markers in space that this space belongs to Russia, or this is patriotism and we should take care in it. So I would just to say that that for me it's not the form but it's the context, and in this case the biggest difference in this context is the settlers colonial logic that having reconstruction which not a reconstruction per se to accommodate the needs of people whose life were destroyed. So it's not a reconstruction for Ukrainians, it's some kind of physical reconstruction. It's highly connected to resettlement, repopulation, reordering, and building something for other people.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I agree with that. All the suburbs look like the same if you compare US suburbs with Moscow suburbs or Asian suburbs. So the idea behind this kind of suburbs are very different, yeah. And if you have public space for kindergartens or for places for child play or something, how much public space you have. So this is also a question of the more democratic or more investment oriented or whatsoever how you call it. Yeah, your concept, I think, for me at least, was quite convincing, and I see the point. I just wanted to push a bit further with our questions to think also about what is actually their build. If you talk about totalitarian remodernization, then maybe this also is also a question. But maybe we have other issues. Please.
Thank you very much for the lecture, and thank you for the topic of which type of architecture is now going there. I wanted to continue the question of modernity in that direction. That is the modern Russian urban planning systems there somehow connected to the previous Soviet traditions in architecture? Because we know a lot about Soviet experience in colonial architecture in Eastern Europe and in Central Asia. But in that case, we are talking more about the conducting of really new structures at the places where it was not very traditional. And as I understand, in case of even Mariupol or Donetsk, they, before the war, they were built already inside these Soviet traditions. So is this modernized Soviet architecture of Russian planning somehow different from what it was before? Or is it just a new case of what was before but somehow worse made? Or so basically what is modernity there if the basement was already kind of close to the new understandings of the Soviet traditions architecture?
Yes, thank you for this interesting question too. So I would say that, of course, in urban planning, there is very, not only in Ukraine or Russia or post-socialist context, but also in Germany, there are very, very strong institutional dependence in urban planning. So it would be maybe interesting also that a lot of German cities after Second World War, they also very planned, sometimes by plans which were developed during the Nazi times. I think the city of Hamburg is like example of that. And many people who were working in these institutions, urban planning institutions in Germany, they were there before Second World War, during Second World War, and after Second World War. So in general, all these disciplines which are embedded in space, in administrative structure, they have very high this past dependency. They are very stable. So for these people who maybe sit in this some bureau, who were given task to, I don't know, build any random town in Ukraine, they don't reflect a lot what does it mean, or they just would copy paste whatever is there because, and this of course is because of Soviet institutional past. There would be also this past dependency across a lot of post-Soviet, post-socialist countries. So I would say, yes, there might be some parts of it or some rebuilding cultures or so-called planning cultures which are present there, which would lead to some kind of similarity. So if you look at them, it's maybe this is the problem, and maybe this is similarity. So having this mass-produced urban planning, which kind of says nothing, it can be anywhere. So this Potemkin village is building out of nowhere. It's kind of a point of it, because if you some kind of in Western audience, a person, and you look in some pictures, and I would show you, oh, this is like a plan of Ukraine, or this is plan of Russia. So for you itself, as long as the picture somehow similar, it's fine, because it means it's all the same. The buildings are reconstructed. So I would say, yes, of course, there is this institutional continuity from Soviet times to current times. There would be also actor continuity. So if we see, there was this example, this is a very good one of this special military construction crews or employment of Russian military buildings. This is the same crews that they were rebuilding in Chechnya or somewhere in other contexts, in other countries. And probably if you look at it, there is some particular style of mass production. So so answering your question, yes, there would be some similarities with previous project tactics, techniques, also this Potemkin village, and building clearly, like not looking what was before, but just building cities from scratch. And even in this lecture, I wanted to show that this warfare and deconstruction is a point of it, to create this land which belongs to one and to build from scratch and not to think about past. And I can also say that it might be a physical form which is similar due to some kind of institutional similarities. But for me, it's not a point. So for me, it just also, and the notion of modernity, it has this spatially embedded character. But for me, there are some nuances. But for me, it's just like, for me as a researcher, it's not so important what kind of buildings in the end you like, or I don't want to make a generalization about building style, but it's more about this social relationship which this all processes of entails, and how it's not, it's, for me, it's not about what to build, but how you build.
Message is clear. Further question?
Maybe just one follow-up, but when I understand the question correctly, it was more that it's this strategy of building from scratch, that this already is a tradition, that this is a Soviet tradition, and it's also a tradition from the source scholars, that we have like this a scheme how to build a city, and you can implement this scheme in any given place, regardless. So mostly there has to be a kind of factory or some kind of extraction site nearby, and then you kind of maybe adapt it. You can adapt it slightly, but nevertheless, this idea that regardless of what there is, regardless of anything given, except for maybe some landscape specificities, you just put a city there. It's just like, it's just a spot on the map.
Yes, I would agree. I think this, I would say it's true. Also, I want to say that maybe first this idea of putting city on a map from scratch, I mean, it does not matter how you get from scratch, you can destroy everything and say it's now from scratch. And also there is also this tradition of help of Soviet republics to build all together. So when I was reading about also this patronage system, I forgot this patronizing system that some regions of Russia, they will go and develop some cities. I think it's also in some reconstruction projects of Soviet Union where also this, I think also in Ukraine, the city of Slavutich was built kind of, I don't remember, by 7 or 9 republics all together after Chernobyl catastrophe. And it was also this project which was like common coast construction project of bringing materials, bringing everything from somewhere and building the city in woods.
But these partnerships you have mentioned seems to go a bit further, also about administration and so on. And this sounds a little bit more like this unification of Germany, where certain states were made responsible for East German states. So also Crimea was organized like that. Yeah, that you had these partnerships, and it was always told that Putin took it from the German unification. I'm not so sure what matters more, the transition, past dependency here, or the German model. Yeah. Okay. Further questions? Yeah. You want to continue this?
Yeah, thank you. I just thought that we need to think not only about the practical image of the cities, but about the general understanding of the city. Because, for example, in Mariupol, if we consider that Azovstal, which is historically the center of the city, is not working anymore after the war, if it's working before. So yeah, the whole it's not only about the architecture and the urban planning, but it's about the question if the city still can be alive as it was before, because especially in Eastern Ukraine, where like coal and all the economics is developed by natural resources, if Azovstal doesn't work anymore, is it somehow reliable, possible to build up anything around it? Is it still needed if it was before, or so how the cities would be understood afterwards, generally, not like practical.
Great question.
Yes, I just want to repeat, no, it all does not work. So it's kind of some artificial situation. Like the settlers, colonial is this artificial situation. You destroyed everything, then you bring new capital, new people, you kind of create some new economic activities. If it's interesting with Mariupol, why Mariupol is particularly important for this settlers colonial exercise, it's because of this destruction of this or targeting of Crimea bridge. They need some kind of land corridor to Crimea, and this is important for them. This rebuilding is kind of attempt to make new corridor also connecting to Crimea. So if we think about some kind of economic significance of it, but I would say yeah, it does not work the way it worked because there is most of the people who lived there, they were either killed or I don't know, were deported. So it's just some kind of artificial situation. And of course, I think at the beginning somewhere I wanted to say that for me, what's interesting in urban planning, it's not urban planning or urban design, which when people sit in office and they made a picture, I don't know, they made master plan. But I see this like bigger dimension of spatial planning, which is interconnected with also capital flows, regional development, and also lived experience of cities. I would say that me myself, I cannot represent lived experience of people in Mariupol. I show this from my positionality as a researcher, being in the Western German institution, living in this German social context where a lot of this peace building narratives without understanding what comes after peace. So yes, so I just wanted to say that it does not work because there is no or very little Ukrainian people left, and it's some kind of violent economic restructuring. And I think this also abilities or attempts to push this development property market. It's also some possibility with these loans to create or to fasten finances or to create some economic activity in that region.
Yeah, but I think this is a crucial point also to expand your argumentation, which I think is great a bit further. So, what kind of if you talk so much about this rebuilding as a top-down totalitarian process, to check a bit more in detail what the ideas are behind, especially if in the case of Mariupol, obviously some of these ideas existed. Also, I is not realized, and so it's not just about how apartments are rebuilt and how to deal with who owns them and who profits from them, and as a kind of colonialization, but also what is the economic vision? Is there an economic vision at all? If there is no economic vision included, then it's also interesting information. So Mariupol was in Ukrainian relatively privileged city. Yeah, you has told me that also, and they are close to the sea. So you can survive without this factory as a tourist center, let's say. Yeah. But then you have also the vision how to rebuild a city for Russian. That's also part of colonialism. Yeah. Yeah. So if you can't answer this, maybe, but it's interesting to go some steps further with your concept, which I think is a good idea to my understanding. Any further question? Last chance. Yeah.
My question is a bit broad, but regarding the reconstruction process and conservation of memory and culture, you mentioned claiming the past, I think. When a Ukrainian building or site is being destroyed or targeted, I mean a Ukrainian building with a high cultural value, how is the culture or the emotional link to the Ukrainian people being memorized and conserved? If my question is clear enough.
I mean, in Ukraine currently, on Ukrainian territory, I mean, yes.
Get my 10,000 steps here.
That's good. Yes, I think a question of memory also a very important one. Probably memory is traditionally in the center of decolonization discussions in terms of urban development, critical urban analysis. Even nowadays, it's not something you discuss in context of war. Also in Germany, it's very present discussion how we deal with traumatic memory and whether there should be some top-down approach or how we create them. So I would say that in Ukraine, particularly if we talk about Mariupol, of course, this master plans or plans proposed by Ukrainian practitioners, they reflect on this topic or they try to deal or propose alternatives or memorization, how it will look in the cities. But I would say it's a lot of vernacular memorialization. This summer I was in Chernivtsi, and then we had some workshop on research methodologies, but in some youth center in Chernivtsi. And then when I came there, the picture or the painting on a wall in some kind of very simplistic, naive manner, the painting was about people sitting in a boat and looking at the Azov steel factory burning. So I would say in Ukraine, of course, it's present a lot on this professional discussions, how we should deal with this past, but it's present in many signs or small signs in space, how people deal with it, how they live small, a reminder of it. Also in social media, there a lot about it. So there is this top-down led or professionals-led attempt to remember what happened but there is a lot of also this vernacular or less professional archiving or a journalist investigation, but also this memorization by people, even like by people being currently refugees in Europe. They also create their own events. They talk about this topics. They share their memories on protests, in public spaces. So this memorization is definitely goes beyond physical places of destruction and traumatization. And it's, of course, if it's allowed, it takes a lot of form. And I don't want to claim that it happens also only on Ukrainian territory. Even if it's not allowed, I believe that people kind of deal with it and keep this memory alive and they keep some signs of it present. So even though I don't know about it, I want to also recognize this memory preservation efforts of those people who stayed in Mariupol, who continues to live there, but continues to keep these memories and talk about them, and maybe one day will contribute also to redevelopment.
Thanks. Want a question, last question? If not, then we conclude here. Thank you so much for your insights. Thank you so much for listening today. And let's stop here. Thank you.